Hello guys, welcome to today's video where I'm going to be doing something a little bit different to what I usually do on the channel. I just want to apologize in advance if I sound a little nasally, a little sniffly. I have gotten a cold. I believe I caught it at the grand final, which is a bit unfortunate, but you know, rather be unwell knowing that my team is the Premiers than to have copped the L. But regardless, today, as you can see by what you can see on the screen, I am on Tier Maker, and I'm going to be grading how I felt certain teams went for the year in terms of like where they finished in comparison to where they probably were expected to finish, or where they felt like they were going to finish. So before we get into today's video, make sure that you hit the like button if you enjoy this content, subscribe if you are new, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss another video of mine. I will be trying to get some footage at the BNF, which as of this recording will be tomorrow. No guarantees. I'll try and, come up to some of the players and ask them some of the questions. There'll be like little fun questions, like they're not going to be anything serious. But if I do get a video for that, make sure you guys stick around for that, because that will be sweet. Alright, so let's grade how everyone went. Let's try and get the obvious one out of the way. Obviously, our Geelong Cats, we know how I feel like, and how everyone else should probably feel like we went this year. A+, really. Like, you finish on top of the ladder, you're 2 games clear, you go into finals with some good momentum. And, aside from the Collingwood game, which was really neck and neck, the prelim and the grand final were massive wins. So, yep, Geelong got a nice green tick. Well done. One thing I will say is that our first 9 rounds, if there's anything I have to criticize, our first 9 rounds are a bit scrappy at best, but I do feel like that was just kind of like those first 2 months where we're just trying to formulate our game plan to make it synergize together, to kind of get used to how the game plan's going to look on game day and whatnot. And from round 10 onwards, we just kind of went bang, and it just kind of worked out really well. So yeah, Geelong Cats get an A+, win a premiership. How could you justify any lower, really? We will start off with the Crows. Now, the Crows are an interesting one because, they didn't do that bad. They actually finished the season 8-14, and they had some pretty good wins. But all things considered, they didn't obviously have the greatest season, and they probably would have liked to have finished higher than the lower end of the ladder. They probably would have liked to have been a team that was in the middle, maybe looking to rebound into finals, but finish that kind of probably more that 12th, 10 to 12th range. So I think I give them a C. I think they got a pass. They played some pretty good kids this year. I think, their big man up forward and Taylor Walker, had a pretty good season as well. I think they had a pretty average season. They probably get a pass, barely. But yeah, it really wasn't one of those seasons where I felt like they would hang the hat off with that performance. They definitely will look to probably try and be a bit more of a threat going into next year, but only time will tell. We'll have to see how the trade period goes, how the draft period goes, and the free agency to see what's next for the Crows. So the next team I want to look at now is the Brisbane Lions. And the Lions, the thing with them is that they played overall actually some really solid football. They probably dropped some games they probably really shouldn't have dropped. Getting thumped at the MCG a couple of times in the home and away season, of course. And even losing a game, I believe it was against Melbourne at the Gabba, and pretty comfortably too, was a massive down bad moment. But, coming to finals, they beat Richmond at the Gabba, which I know a lot of the experts rated Richmond to win that game, but I honestly felt like, if Brisbane were going to win a final, it would be that one at home, where the crowd would really get into it and back them in to win it, and they did win it in all to their credit. And the game that probably surprised most people was Brisbane getting over the top of Melbourne at the MCG, considering we know how bad the Lions are at Melbourne. and getting all the way to a prelim where they did lose to the eventual premiers in Geelong. So if we were looking at just the home and away season, considering that they were considered a top 4 game for most of the year and then slipped down to 6 because of bad form, I'd be probably putting them around here. But considering that they had a really good finals campaign, considering that they did get kind of thumped in the end to the Cats in the prelim, I'm going to put them around here. I think they had a pretty good solid season. I think Brisbane fans can hang their hat off knowing that there is some potential there, that the talent is there for their club, that they got some really good players. Lockie Neal barely missing out on the Brownlow by one mere vote to the eventual winner, Paddy Cripps. I think the Lions overall had a really good season, but they just need to outside of those like final games that they played, or outside of that one final, I should really say, because they played Geelong at Melbourne and got cooked. But they really need to fix their MCG record, because the reality is, at the end of the day, if the Lions want to win a premiership at some point, they need to win at Melbourne. It's as simple as that. All right, so the next team that I want to look at is the Carlton Blues, and they're an interesting one because a lot of people were tipping the Blues to actually have a pretty solid season this year, where they were thinking that they were going to make finals, like not top 4, like they might slip between like that kind of 6th, 7th range, where they would have a crack at finals. Maybe they win first week, and then that's about it. And if that was their season, like they made finals, won like the first week, lose in the second week, I would have said, yep, that's a B+ season, because, you know, that's solid. That's where they wanted to get to, and probably a little bit more. So that's a really solid season. But knowing the way how Carlton finished the year, when they had, I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, they had 4 or 5 of their last games to win. They just needed to win one to ultimately more than likely secure their spot in the finals, and they lost all of them. So with considering how poor their finish has been, I'm honestly going to have to give them a C+. I know this is a year where Paddy Cripps did win the Brownlow, and I know the Blues have a lot of talent in their list, and they have a lot of potential, and they will probably go again. And to be honest, they probably will make the finals. They're going to use this past year to motivate them to be like, you know, we were good enough to be there. We only lost to Collingwood by a point, and Collingwood were a team that were only 1 point themselves away from a potential prelim. So, you know, they're going to be kicking themselves in the gut in a year where they had the Brownlow winner in Paddy Cripps. But, you know, when looking at the year that they had in a nutshell, considering how good they were going for the whole year, where they were even potentially talked about as being top 4 at one stage because of how good they were playing, to finish the way that they did and to fail in the way that they did, considering they had such a strong campaign going into it, you know, I'm going to say it's a slight above pass, because all things considered, they were competitive. They have shown signs that they are improving, that they have some good plays in there. But to be honest, when they needed to stand up, they didn't. They lost their last 4 or 5, whatever it was, in a row to miss out on a top 8 spot. And to be honest, that's just not good enough. At an elite level, when you're a bunch of professionals and you're getting paid to, you know, win the games you should be winning, it's not good enough. All right, the next team I have is the Collingwood Magpies. Now, obviously, coming from the 21 season, they were in the bottom 4. I think they were 16th, if I am not mistaken. And this year they finished 4th, losing to Geelong in that qualifying final by the 1 kick, and then winning in the second week, and then in the prelim losing to the Swans by 1 measly point. Collingwood had a very, very good season, and they've got a lot of upside going into next year. And honestly, they're going to be a very scary side to handle, considering that, you know, outside of those like 2 games I had in the finals, when the game has been close, more times than not, they've been able to win it. They did go into the finals with a massive winning streak as well, obviously it being snapped by yours truly, Geelong. But yeah, they played really well for the year, and like I know some people might be saying that they some of the clubs they were beating by like under 1 or 2 goals were like average clubs, but at the end of the day, when the game is tight and you need to win it, they were still able to win them. They still got the job done, and it shows a lot of like scary characteristics going into next year. So honestly, I think they got an A. I think Collingwood had a really good season. I think they should be really happy with what they've accomplished, especially in comparison to last year in 2021. They're going to be a very scary side going into next year, and I won't be surprised if Collingwood go potentially one match further next year if they can replicate an even better performance going into next year. Now, the next team I want to look at is the Essendon Bombers. Now, I know a lot of like the Bombers faithful would be like, look, don't even bother with this, just chuck them straight in F. But hear me out, the Bombers had a couple of good games where they played really well and that they've showed some character. They did beat Sydney, I believe, during the home and away season, who Sydney were the runners-up this year. So, and Sydney are a very solid team. They've had some good wins, but I think the big issue with the Bombers is that they didn't really have a game plan that was identifiable, and they didn't really have like a way to snap like a bad streak of plays in a match, and they just crumbled. And because of that, like they never really had a chance to get ahead in games. They couldn't figure out what they needed to do to pick the opponents apart. And to be honest, like it just felt like there was just some games where they were just kicking and hoping, like just praying, crossing their fingers, and just hoping it falls into a red and black lap. But at this elite level, that's not going to work. So I am going to put them in D. They do have some signs, and I don't think, like, in comparison to where they were expecting to finish, which was the bottom half of the top 8, you would probably think it's a straight fail. But I honestly also think that the media and everyone else is kind of overhyping the Bombers on how good they were actually going to be this year. So, and I think they did show some promising signs. And to be honest, their win against the Swans was like a massive, massive tick. So, and they had some pretty good games as well. They only lost to Collingwood, with a literal kick after the siren as well. So they've shown some promising signs and they've shown some improvement. But all things considered, like it was still a pretty miserable season to be a Bombers fan. So better luck next year. All right, the next team I want to talk about is the Richmond Tigers. And to be honest, like Richmond played all right. Like they were one of those teams that performed well for the most part. They had some pretty good games. They were very competitive for a lot of them. They gave Geelong a run for their money, with Geelong having to get the lead with under 2 minutes to go, or whatever it was at the time at the MCG. They've been very competitive, and they always are considered competitive, and they hold themselves in high regard. But the thing with the Tigers is that there was a few games this year that they played, that they lost, that they really probably shouldn't be losing. Like, if I could think about some of them, like the Gold Coast game. Now, granted, and I will get to Gold Coast in a minute, they are a much improved side, and I feel like Gold Coast are a much better team than people give them credit for. But they're losing to teams like the Suns, where really, like, they should, in theory, still be a better team than the Suns, and they're losing to teams like that. So I think the biggest issue with Richmond this year is that they didn't necessarily go into a game and think, yep, we've got this, let's just tick it off. As long as we play our game plan, we should win. There was a lot of games where you just didn't know what Tigers you were going to get. You were going to get the Tigers that were bold and daring and willing to take it up to the top 4 teams, right? But then you had the Tigers that were losing to like an Adelaide, or struggling against an Essendon, or losing to a Gold Coast, So I think all things considered, Like, they did make the finals, and they did lose in that first week when a lot of the experts expected them to win it. So I think it was an okay season. Like, I think they could be happy with that, but, you know, they're not really ecstatic with it. Like, they're probably still a little bit dissatisfied with it overall, and they will look to be a lot more competitive going into next year and try to maybe move themselves up a bit on the ladder and try and maybe go one or two more games deeper into the finals. Now, the next team I want to talk about is North Melbourne, who are obviously an A+. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. North Melbourne, like they were kind of expected to not do great into the 2022 season. You know, they had some promising young players coming in, including the number 1 draft pick and whatnot. But, you know, they weren't really expected to do that great. And to be honest, they did what they were kind of expected to do, and even a little bit worse. They weren't really competitive at all. They had like 2 wins for the year, and like one of those wins was against a freaking waffle West Coast side, and the other one I can't even remember who it was against, but you know, it was again one of those other lucky wins, all things considered, like catching the team on a bad day. And other than that, they just weren't really competitive. There's a lot of games where they just were really off the mark. They weren't even competitive. They couldn't bring it up to the opposition. And very few times, I could probably count, like, on one hand, if I ignore their wins, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times they were actually competitive and actually gave a, you know, SHIT of the result. But outside of that, they didn't play very well, so they get an F. Even though they kind of played where they were expected to, they, in theory, did even worse. Like, to only get 2 wins for the year is very poor. Very, very poor. Like, it's not good enough, honestly. And, I mean, frick, if it gets any worse going into 23, then there needs to be some serious change at that football club. I know Alistair Clarkson was hired to be the head coach. Obviously, he's under certain speculations and accusations at the moment, so his position's been put on hold. So, assuming that North Melbourne, for whatever reason, don't get Alistair Clarkson as their head coach, they're going to have to go through the turmoil again of finding a new head coach, and that's already stressful as it is when you don't even know if your playing group's going to be up to it. So, we'll have to wait and see on that one. And the next team I want to talk about, just whilst we're kind of on this downward trend, I also want to talk about the West Coast Eagles really quickly. They were a team that were actually expected to still be competitive, because the difference with like North Melbourne and West Coast is that North Melbourne have a lot of players who are still young, inexperienced, need some more games under their belt, and they haven't really formulated like a winning game plan. Whereas like a West Coast, they have still most of their elite talent, and you know, going into 22, like it only had been like 3.5, 4 years since they won the premiership in 2018. So they were considered like a very competitive side still. You know, even in 2019, I think they made the finals as well. So really, it was just like, I don't know what COVID did to their waters, but the Eagles were just not onto it at all. Like, they were just pathetic for a lot of the year. Again, just like North Melbourne, they only won the 2 games. They didn't play very well. They played a lot worse than probably what some people were expecting them to do, so they get a definite F. I think it was a fail of a season. They need to go through some shocking changes to have any hope of, you know, reigniting this club, this proud club of, you know, the Western Australian community. They need to go through a lot of change, and you know, if they don't do something drastic to try and at least make themselves somewhat competitive going into next year, you know, heads are going to have to roll, or else the club's just going to implode, unfortunately. So the next Perth club I want to talk about, whilst we're on that topic, is the Dockers, who had a pretty polar opposite kind of season to the Eagles. The Dockers were very competitive. They played really well. They've taken some massive scalps, including beating yours truly, the Geelong Cats, at GMHBA, which was a shocking loss. Um, and they've beaten some other clubs along the way as well. And I think they showed a lot of promise in what they can offer in the competition. But again, I feel like the biggest issue with the Dockers is their consistency in their game plan. There was a few times where this year specifically, they just kind of faltered, and against teams that kind of really put the pressure on them. So like your Collingwood was like a really good example in that final series. They just kind of faltered, and when their game plan didn't work, it just really did not work. Like they just got flattened. Even against the Bulldogs, like if it had not been for the Bulldogs kind of, for some reason, just lacking intensity after that first quarter and a bit, they probably would have been smashed in Perth. So, but obviously credit to Fremantle for standing up when they really needed to and not just getting back into that game, but actually taking the win by 13 points, I believe it was in the end. But there's been a few question marks on whether their talent and their team chemistry in their lineup is good enough to contend with the big dogs of this year's competition. They were, at most parts of the year, considered to be one of the top 4 teams in the comp. I wouldn't say they were flag favourites at any point, but they were really in that conversation of, okay, Fremantle, can they win a flag this year? They can. But then they just kind of faltered at points. So I think all in all, they had a pretty good season. Like, I think they did really well. They managed to get through the first week of finals despite slipping down to 5th and missing out on the top 4 spot. Losing to Collingwood, at the MCG was a little disappointing. They looked a bit flat in that game, and Collingwood just had control of it for most of the game. So that was like a bit of a disappointing end to their year, but all things considered, I think Freo fans should be excited. I think they've got a pretty good side with them for years to come. And, if they add to their list, they can only get better. So, again, they will probably be a team that will be looking to fight for a top 4 spot going into next year. But, look, the AFL is a very funny game. Teams can just flip-flop all across the ladder very easily. But I think if Fremantle stick with what they've got and just look to improve it and work on their craft, they could definitely push for a top 4 spot next year. The next team I want to talk about is the Gold Coast Suns. And look, Gold Coast, I think, were really good. They've had probably their best season they've had since their establishment in the competition. They played some really good games. They've beaten some pretty good teams. And they've just looked competitive. Like, yes, they lacked their edge a little bit in trying to actually earn a final spot when they needed to probably stand up in a few games. But the potential is there. Like, they've got some really good players in that list. They've got some good young youth that's coming in to their side, and, they look dangerous. And going forward, like, they can only get better. So all things considered, I think they had a really solid season. I'm giving them a B-. I think the Suns could be more happy with the way their season went than the Richmond faithful and the Carlton faithful would, because the Suns showed a lot of promise in their game plan. They've shown a will to win, which has been one thing that I feel like a lot of teams lack sometimes, is just that pure will to win. Like, I feel like that's what Geelong have done really well this year, especially in the tight ones. Like, against your Richmond, against your Collingwood, and a few other tight games we've had, bar that game against Fremantle in Geelong. We've just had a will to win. We've been willing to try and find a way to get ourselves over the line and win the match. And I feel like Gold Coast have started to discover that. And look, if the Heat gets turned up at the Suns, like they could be a very dangerous side. So they'll be a team to look out for. I think, you know, with a couple of additions and a good preseason behind them, they could honestly crack the top eight. No joke. Like they've got some good talent in that side, and it's only going to get better with another year to add to the list. The next team I want to talk about is Hawthorn. And I'm going to be honest, I'm just going to whack them straight and see. They are the definition of a pass, right? They came into the year probably wanting to be competitive, wanted to avoid the bottom four, and if I check the ladder, they did actually avoid the bottom four by a game. So they probably came into the year, wanting to be competitive, avoid the bottom four, win some games, get some games under their young youth, and just be a little bit competitive. And look, to be honest, they ticked all those boxes. So they get a grading where they probably passed in the year, like they went where they kind of expected and hit the mark. But obviously that doesn't mean that, they're content with the way the year has gone. They would obviously want to be a team that's competitive and go back to their glory years. So yeah, look, the Hawthorn group, they are a very prideful bunch, especially their supporters. They are a very prideful bunch. They take great pride in their club and what they have achieved. In their recent years throughout, the 2010s, obviously winning those 3 premierships in a row, and just always being a threat whenever they make a final series. So I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to make finals next year, but I think they are a team that wants to try and make finals next year. Now that they've kind of probably tried out some things and assessed some roles in the team, I think Mitchell has done a pretty solid job in the coaching role. And, it's just wait and see, I guess, at the Hawthorn club. So, I think they will improve, but by how much, couldn't tell you. The next team I want to look at is the Greater Western Sydney Giants. Now, here's the thing with the Giants. They were a team that was scouted to be a big powerhouse threat for years to come. Obviously, in 2019, they had made the grand final and got thumped in it. And then 2020 took a big impact on a lot of clubs, I'll be honest. Like 2020 and even 21 with COVID and stuff. And here's the thing, like with a lot of these clubs and their development, that I just want you guys to remember. COVID 100% would have had a big impact on certain development of players because of the rules with limited spacing and, how many groups of players can work with each other at a certain time and etc. etc. It 100% would have taken a big impact on certain clubs and certain players even with their development, especially younger players, prior to going into a year, so this year 22, where we finally have I'm going to say a 95% normal season, like with a couple of COVID hiccups here and there. So, this club, this Giants, they were thought to be a team that will be contending for years to come after making the grand final in 2019. And going into 22, literally 3 years after that, they sit with 6 wins and bottom 4. It's a really, really poor year. So I think, I want to say it's an F, but I don't think it's been a fail because they have been competitive at times. They just haven't really lived up to expectations. So I think they kind of go on the same grading as the Bombers, where they probably got overhyped, I'll be honest. Like, their list isn't as good as probably some people think kind of deal. But that's not to say that a lot of people at the Greater Western Sydney team wouldn't be extremely disappointed with how the year has gone and would be hoping to have much better success going into the next season. The next team I want to talk about is the Port Adelaide Power. Now, they started the year 0-5, at the end of round 5. And at that point, most teams probably just put a line through finals at that point. Like, they just forget about it. Like, there's no point. But the Power actually, like, they came back pretty hard. Like, they ended the year 10 wins and 12 losses. But after that 0-5 start, that basically means they went 10-7, which is pretty good. Like, 10-7 is probably still not enough to make finals. Like, they'd have to somehow in their next string of games, because if we look at like how the ladder has gone for this year, right? So you look at a team like the Bulldogs, who are 12-10. You look at Richmond, who are 13-8, and Brisbane, who are 15-7, which is where I believe this big jump formulates from. Like, realistically speaking, like, if a few of those games are obviously wins, they would probably just barely make the finals looking at the ladder. But typically speaking, like, usually you would need at least 14, 15 wins to make finals, with this year being one of those exempt years where the whole competition was so tight that a lot of teams are just kind of trading wins with each other. So yeah, look, they could have honestly made finals, and up until like round 20, I think it was, or 21, I think there was still a slight chance if they had win certain games and had certain results go their way. But all things considered, they were a team that, in 21, they were a top 4 team. They, I think they made the prelim, if memory serves me correct. Fully believed that they would make at least finals this year, and they missed out after a really poor start to the season. So I think they get a C minus. I don't think they get the same grade as the Bombers and the Giants, because they are two clubs that did so poorly compared to what they expected. But at the same time, I think the Power, like, given how they started 0-5 and then ended up the season 10-12, that's kind of like their saving grace, because they finished 10-7 after that, which means that they were competitive and were winning games. But that start really just killed them. Like, that start probably put an end to their season before it even had a chance to properly begin, with just barely a month of football being played. So disappointing for the Power. They definitely will want to try and make finals next year, and I honestly think they can. They are a pretty good side, and they are pretty hard to beat at home in Adelaide. So, if they can bank, 8 to 10 wins at home next year, and then get like a couple of wins here and there, like one at the G, maybe one, in Sydney against like a GWS or something, and then maybe one against a Gold Coast or a Brisbane in Perth. A Brisbane in Brisbane with like a shock win. All of a sudden, they're probably looking at like a top 6 finish. So just have to wait and see for that one. Next team I want to talk about is the St Kilda Saints, and they started the year 8-3. 8-3, and I remember in round 9 they had beaten us, Geelong. And I remember, I do have the tweet. I did make a tweet about it. I remember after that game being so annoyed that we lost to the Saints, saying that we shouldn't be losing to mid-table sides. And a lot of people were just like, you don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? St Kilda mid-table? Are you, like, dumb? Are you silly? They're top 4 side. And, back then I thought they were a mid-table side. And this year they finished as mid-table as you can get. I think they finished 10th, if I'm not mistaken, on the ladder. Yep. There they are, 11-11. They are as mid-table as it gets. 50-50% win rate and barely under 100% points for and against. So they were the definition of mid-table. And with that, they probably get a mid-table result, a C+. I give them a C+ because they did better than probably what they were hoping slightly. Like, they were probably hoping to have a year where they were competitive and looking to contend for finals. But considering at one point they were rated to be a top 4 side and then lost that, that's kind of what drags them down a bit, but then pushes them up a little bit, because they were in a spot where they were talked about as a top 4 side and a potential contender even. So they get a C+ for me. all things considered, with how their season went. Next team I want to talk about is the Western Bulldogs, and the Western Bulldogs, like, they were a team expecting to make finals, and they did, barely, due to the last game of the literal season going in their favour and making it in by, I think it was like 0.6%, getting a spot in the top 8. So, they went into the year wanting to make finals and do a bit of damage. They barely made it in. And then through a massive lead that they had against the Dockers in Perth to lose in the first week of finals, it's pretty disappointing, all things considered. And I don't think they won't be happy with the way that they finish the season. But with all things considered, they do get a C+. I think they have shown signs of competitiveness in the year. They have some really good talent in their list. And to be honest, they do look a bit terrifying when it's their day. So, 100%, I think they will only improve going into 23. But, I'm going to be honest, if the Bulldogs go into next year wanting to improve and they finish around the same spot, like 8th to 10th, I'd probably push them down to a C- if they do that next year, because, they've shown promise and they want to improve, but now they actually have to do it. So, the Bulldogs, I think, had a decent season. I think Bulldog supporters would be okay with it. They'd be somewhat satisfied they at least made the finals, but probably threw away a big chance at having a big scalp by not getting the job done against Fremantle in Perth in that first week of the finals. The next team I want to talk about is the Melbourne Demons, and the Melbourne Demons is a funny one because they did finish top 2 in the ladder, but barely did they finish top 2 because they were stumbling. And if you looked at the way that they played this final series, they just looked hopeless. They looked lost. They looked like they didn't have a game plan. They didn't look synergistic at all. And to be honest, they were just really disappointing. I think they're not really happy with the way their season has played out in the finals. And they had a really good start to the year, as expected, as the at the time reigning premiers. If they had finished second, ignoring their last month and a half, 2 months of football, they'd probably be getting here. And if they made the prelim, that is as well. But with the way that they finished the year and with their straight sets exit, I honestly think I give them a B-. I think they played really poorly at the end there. And the only reason why they get a B- is because they finished top 2. Even though that top 2 finish was useless because they went out in straight sets anyway. They weren't at least even able to get a win during the finals, and they lost a few games that they probably should have won in the home and away season as well. So I know it's a bit harsh, Demon fans, but honestly, I don't think this is a year that they'd be too proud of. I think they could be content, like I said, that they were competitive and that they did make the finals. And look, to be honest, they probably will be looking to try and make top 4 going into next year. And I think if they do make top 4 next year, that's a positive tick because it shows that they are still a team looking to contend. They're not satisfied with just winning it in 21 and calling it a day. But with the way everything had finished, I don't think they'd be too pleased with their season as a whole. Looking at their last month and a half of football in a nutshell. And the last team that I want to look at is the Sydney Swans, the team that were the runners-up in the grand final. And I honestly think they had a really good year this year. They got to have Buddy's 1,000th against Geelong. They were very competitive. They were hard to beat at home. They took a lot of scalps. They kind of flew under the radar a little bit. There was even times going into the later stages of the year where they weren't even considered as contenders, where teams like Collingwood, Geelong, Brisbane at times, Fremantle, Melbourne, even Richmond were talked about as like, actual contenders going to the year. And Sydney just kind of flew under the radar a little bit. They were talked about at times, but not really. And they had some shocking losses, which does include the loss against the Dons. But overall, I think they had a really good year, and I think they could be happy with it. Like, if you were to ignore how the grand final went, in a nutshell, the Sydney Swans had a fantastic year. And I think Sydney supporters can only be excited with what's to come. Like, they have a lot to look forward to going into this year, and I think they're getting an A from me. I think they had a really good year. I think they could be really pleased with how it went. Obviously, didn't get the desired results in the grand final, thankfully. But, with all that considered, I think they had a year that they can be pleased with. And 100% they will be trying to make top four going into next year. And probably try to get to the grand final once more to try and have another crack at it. That is my grading list, how I thought all the teams went for the year. You can see I've got kind of like a heavy clump towards this like B minus C range, because I think because the way the season was like so tight and competitive, there was a lot of teams that lost games they probably didn't expect to lose and won games that they probably shouldn't have won. And I think it's really manipulated the year for a lot of teams to be caught up in this bunch. But yeah, I think overall this is the way the grading stands. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think you would grade any teams higher or lower than what I've got? Obviously, Geelong can't really go any higher, and North Melbourne and Eagles can't really go any lower. So, if you want, let me know in the comments, where would you grade these specific teams in the comp, and, where do you think these teams will finish next year? Do you think they will improve? Do you think they will decline? Or do you think they'll kind of stagnate? Let me know in the comment section. Thank you for watching. Have a good day or night, wherever it is you are in the world, and I will see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Thank you.